Imagine a world where 12-year-old girls were forced into marriage, where men could kill their unfaithful wives without consequences, and where the emperor himself held contests to see who could sleep with the most people in one night. That world existed. It was ancient Rome. Think our modern dating apps and relationships are complicated. Wait until you discover how our Roman ancestors handled love, seduction, and desire. Their methods were so outrageous, so shocking, they would make even the most daring among us blush with shame. But before you find out all that, tell me, where are you listening to this story? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you can discover more similar stories. In the cobbled streets of Rome, behind the majestic facades of patrician villas, secrets often hide that official history prefers to keep quiet. Secrets about how Romans met, seduced, loved, and betrayed each other. For in Rome, love wasn't just a matter of the heart. It was a political weapon, an instrument of power, sometimes even a matter of life or death. Today, we will lift the veil on these mysteries. We will discover how a simple glance exchanged in the amphitheater could spark a consuming passion. How the most respected women in society transformed themselves into courtesans in the shadows, and how emperors themselves did not hesitate to defy convention to satisfy their wildest desires. But before delving into these forbidden tales, it is essential to understand the foundations of Roman society, a foundation that made love a luxury few could afford, and marriage a commercial transaction unrelated to heartbeats. The Romans considered romantic love a weakness, a dangerous distraction that could compromise the interests of family and state. Yet, paradoxically, this same society would become famous for its sexual excesses, scandalous affairs, and unparalleled debauchery. How did this contradiction arise? The answer lies in the understanding that the Romans separated love from marriage, passion from duty, desire from respectability. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about ancient relationships. These aren't the sugar-coated tales in your history textbooks. These are raw, unfiltered accounts of how real people dealt with desire in one of the most complex societies in history. From arranged child marriages to the underworld of cemetery prostitutes, from gladiators who drove women mad with lust to laws allowing fathers to execute their daughters for adultery. Ancient Rome was a place where the sacred and the profane intertwined in ways unimaginable today. So settle in, because we're about to journey into a world where love was dangerous, pleasure was political, and breaking the rules could cost you dearly. In Rome, romantic love was considered a weakness, a dangerous distraction that could compromise the interests of family and state. Marriage had only one objective: to create political alliances and produce legitimate heirs. Roman fathers saw their daughters as pieces on a giant chessboard. Each union was calculated, weighed, negotiated like a commercial transaction. Love, a luxury that only poets dared sing about, and even then, usually for forbidden or extramarital loves. Picture this scene: a 12-year-old girl, barely out of childhood, suddenly finds herself promised to a man she may have never met. Her childhood toys are solemnly offered to Venus on the eve of the wedding, symbolizing her forced passage into adulthood. She wears an immaculate white tunic, a blood-red veil, and a crown of flowers she picked herself, the last vestiges of her lost innocence. The system was so rigid that 3 distinct forms of marriage existed, each with its own merciless rules. Confarreatio was reserved for the patrician elite. In the presence of the high priest and before family representatives, the spouses shared a sacred cake made of stelt. This ritual literally transferred the woman from her father's power to that of her husband. She lost her name, her identity, her freedom. For the plebeians, there was coemptio, literally, purchase. The ceremony resembled an auction more than a celebration of love. The husband bought his wife in the presence of a magistrate and 5 witnesses, holding scales and coins, as for any other commercial transaction. The bride stood there like merchandise being appraised, her value determined not by her character or desires, but by her family's political connections and the dowry she could bring. But perhaps most disturbing was usage, marriage by usage. If a woman lived with a man for a complete year without absenting herself for 3 consecutive nights, she automatically fell under his legal authority. It was a form of matrimonial prescription that transformed cohabitation into legal slavery. Imagine the psychological pressure on a woman knowing that a few days away from home could trap her forever. The consequences of these arranged unions were often dramatic. Roman chronicles are full of stories of young wives who couldn't bear their fate. Some took refuge in religion, others in adultery, the most desperate in death. Because, once married, a Roman woman no longer existed legally. She had become her husband's property, just like his slaves or furniture. The age requirements were particularly shocking by today's standards. Girls could be legally married at 12, boys at 14. But in practice, many arrangements were made even earlier. Betrothal contracts were sometimes signed when children were still infants, their entire lives mapped out before they could even speak. These child marriages weren't just legal formalities, they were consummated. Medical texts from the period discuss the physical damage inflicted on young girls forced into sexual relations before their bodies were ready. The mortality rate among young mothers was staggering, yet society considered this acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of political advancement. The wedding ceremony itself was designed to emphasize the bride's complete subjugation. She was literally given away by her father, passed like property from one man to another. The traditional wedding vow wasn't about love or companionship. It was a legal formula acknowledging the transfer of ownership. "Where you are master, I am mistress," the bride would say. But this apparent equality was pure illusion. The dowry system added another layer of complexity to these transactions. A bride's family had to pay the groom for the privilege of taking their daughter. This payment, called dose, theoretically remained the woman's property, but her husband controlled it completely during the marriage. If she displeased him or failed to produce male heirs, she could find herself divorced and destitute, as the dowry might be forfeit. Yet, even in this merciless system, love sometimes found its way. Some spouses learned to respect, even genuinely love each other. Funeral inscriptions testify to real marital affection, couples who supported each other through trials. But these cases remained the exception in a world where feelings always had to yield to practical considerations. The wedding night held its own terrors. Young girls, often ignorant of sexual matters, were expected to submit to their husband's desires without question. There was no concept of consent as we understand it today. A husband's sexual rights over his wife were absolute and unquestionable. Martial rape within marriage wasn't just legal, it was expected. Some families tried to prepare their daughters for married life, but this preparation focused on duty, not pleasure. Girls were taught to endure, not to enjoy. They learned that their purpose was reproduction, not companionship. Their own desires and preferences were irrelevant to the transaction. The psychological impact on these young brides must have been devastating. Torn from their families, thrust into intimate relationships with strangers, expected to produce children while still children themselves. It's no wonder that many sought escape through whatever means available. Divorce, a Roman invention that was revolutionary for its time, offered an escape route for those who had the means. A husband need only pronounce the fatal formula, "Take your things and go." But here again, inequality was glaring. Women could initiate separation only under exceptional circumstances, and even then, they usually lost their children and their dowry. This brutal reality of Roman marriage explains why so many men and women sought love and pleasure elsewhere. Because if marriage was a matter of duty, passion flourished in the shadows, far from social conventions. And that's where our story becomes truly interesting. But before we explore those shadow realms of forbidden love, we must understand where Romans actually met when they dared to follow their hearts instead of their families' ambitions. Because despite all the restrictions, desire found a way. It always does. If marriage was the domain of fathers and contracts, seduction belonged to furtive glances and clandestine encounters. In Rome, every public space could become a theater of romance. Every social event an opportunity to break the chains of propriety. The Circus Maximus was undoubtedly the most famous of these meeting places. This gigantic arena that could accommodate up to 250,000 spectators wasn't just the temple of chariot racing. It was the Tinder of antiquity, the place where eyes met and hearts raced faster than horses on the track. Ovid, the master of the art of love, explicitly advised young men to frequent the games to meet women there. In the delirious crowd cheering their favorite charioteer, it was easy to choose the one you'd want to love. A pretext to sit next to a beautiful stranger, a shared bet on the race outcome, and conversation was engaged. But be warned, these encounters were far from innocent. The electric atmosphere of the games, the proximity of bodies in the packed stands, the collective excitement created a climate conducive to excess. Married women took advantage of these outings to escape their husbands' surveillance. They came accompanied by their complicit servants, ready to transmit discreet messages or arrange secret rendezvous. The seating arrangement itself facilitated these forbidden encounters. While social hierarchy was officially maintained, the sheer size of the crowd made surveillance impossible. A woman could easily claim she was watching the races while actually exchanging meaningful glances with someone across the arena. The roar of the crowd provided perfect cover for whispered conversations and hastily arranged meetings. Ovid's advice was remarkably specific. Arrive early to secure a good seat, offer to share your cushion, brush dust from your neighbor's dress, engage in conversation about the horses and drivers. These seemingly innocent interactions were actually a sophisticated system of courtship that operated under the noses of husbands and fathers. The games lasted all day, providing ample opportunity for relationships to develop. What began as casual conversation in the morning might evolve into passionate declarations by sunset. The shared excitement of the races created an artificial intimacy that could quickly turn into something more meaningful. Theaters offered a more refined setting, but were equally conducive to romantic encounters. Unlike the Circus Maximus stands, where social classes mingled, theaters respected strict hierarchy. This segregation paradoxically allowed for more intimate interaction, The elite could observe each other discreetly, exchange complicit glances during performances. The plays themselves often served as pretexts for seduction games. Love intrigues on stage inspired those in the audience. People came as much to see and be seen as to appreciate the dramatic qualities of the performance. Women wore their finest attire, perfumed and made up with consummate art. The theater's architecture facilitated these encounters. The curved seating brought people together in intimate spaces while maintaining the illusion of propriety. A woman could attend with her family while secretly communicating with an admirer seated nearby. Messages could be passed, meetings arranged, all under the guise of cultural appreciation. But it was perhaps the public baths that offered the most audacious opportunities. These establishments, present in all cities of the empire, were much more than simple places of hygiene. They were veritable social clubs, where Romans spent entire hours relaxing, conversing, and seducing. The mixed nature of the baths varied by establishment and era. But even when men and women were separated, clandestine arrangements could be made. The massages, beauty treatments, and steamy, sensual atmosphere of these places created a troubling intimacy. Many respectable wives formed liaisons there with handsome slaves or free men seeking adventure. The bath complexes were enormous, containing multiple pools at different temperatures, steam rooms, exercise areas, libraries, and shops. This variety of spaces provided numerous opportunities for private encounters. A chance meeting in the tepidarium, a conversation that began over a game in the palestra. Relationships could develop naturally in these settings. Prostitutes had made the baths their preferred hunting ground. Claudine Dauphin, a specialist of the period, notes that famous courtesans and common harlots all met in the public baths, which were already frequented in the Roman period by prostitutes of both sexes. The line between legitimate socializing and commercial sex was deliberately blurred in these steamy environments. Religious festivals represented another category of particularly prized meeting places. Paradoxically, these events meant to honor the gods often became occasions to transgress moral prohibitions. The festivals of Venus or Flora were renowned for their excesses. Usual social conventions temporarily faded, allowing women to drink wine and mingle more freely with men. These festivals created a kind of parenthesis in Roman social life. Collective intoxication, music, sensual dances freed usually repressed instincts. It was an opportunity for young people of both sexes to meet in a less constrained atmosphere than everyday life. The festival of Lupercalia was particularly notorious. Young men ran naked through the streets, whipping women with goatskin thongs, supposedly to ensure fertility. But this ritualized violence provided cover for all sorts of sexual encounters. The festival's chaos made normal social surveillance impossible. Even funeral ceremonies, despite being marked by mourning, didn't escape this logic. Wake vigils brought together families and their allies. In these emotionally charged moments, unexpected attractions sometimes arose. Arranged marriages were often concluded at these family gatherings, where grief and desire intermingled in complex ways. The Roman calendar was packed with festivals throughout the year, each providing its own opportunities for romantic encounter. The Florilia celebrated the goddess of flowers and fertility with theatrical performances that were notoriously bawdy. The Bacchanalia, though officially suppressed for their excesses, continued in secret, offering the ultimate in transgressive pleasure. Markets and shopping areas provided more mundane but equally effective meeting places. The Forum Romanum wasn't just the center of political and commercial life. It was also where people went to see and be seen. The porticos provided sheltered walkways where couples could stroll and converse away from the bustle of the main squares. Private dinner parties among the wealthy offered perhaps the most sophisticated venues for romantic intrigue. These elaborate affairs could last for hours, with multiple courses, entertainment, and extensive wine consumption. The reclining couches used for dining facilitated intimate conversation and physical contact that would be impossible in more formal settings. This geography of Roman love reveals just how sophisticated Romans had become in the culture of seduction. Constrained by a rigid matrimonial system, they had invented 1,000 ways to circumvent prohibitions. Every public outing became a hunt for glances. Every social event an opportunity to break conjugal monotony. But these dangerous games came at a price. Behind the smiles and flirtations lay a much darker reality, that of a society founded on inequality between the sexes and exploitation of the weakest. The very places that enabled romantic encounters also harbored a thriving industry of sexual commerce that would shock us today. Rome was a society of disturbing paradoxes. On one side, it preached virtue, family piety, respect for ancestral traditions. On the other, it tolerated and even encouraged a deeply unequal sexual system where men's pleasures took precedence over everything else. To understand this contradiction, we must grasp the Roman mentality. A man was only truly a man if he exercised his domination, including sexual domination, over others. This domination was first expressed in his own home, over his slaves of both sexes, then extended to all of society through a complex network of power relationships. A Roman citizen, theoretically, had the right to sleep with any slave in his household, male or female, without this calling his respectability into question. These relationships weren't considered adultery, because adultery implied an attack on another citizen's rights. Since a slave had no rights, their body belonged entirely to their master. This mentality explains the emergence of an extraordinarily developed pleasure industry. Rome counted thousands of prostitutes distributed in a complex hierarchy. At the top were luxury courtesans, true stars of their era. These women, often freed slaves or of Greek origin, combined beauty, intelligence, and culture. They held salons, influenced politics, inspired poets, but the majority of Roman prostitutes lived in far more sordid conditions. The lupanars, whose name derives from lupa, the she-wolf, an animal associated with prostitution, were dark and cramped establishments where women reduced to the state of merchandise were packed together. Prices varied enormously, from a few asses for the most basic services to fortunes for a night with a renowned courtesan. At Pompeii, graffiti found in the famous Lupanar gives us a raw glimpse of this reality. Here I have F*** seeked many girls, boasts one client, Restituta, Felix's slave, knows how to use her tongue well, praises another. These inscriptions testify to a mercantile sexuality where women were evaluated like cattle. The price system reveals the extreme stratification of this industry. The cheapest prostitutes, nicknamed quadrantaria because they cost a quarter of an as, earned less than an agricultural laborer. At the other extreme, some courtesans accumulated considerable fortunes. According to Pliny the Elder, the dictator Sulla's wealth came partly from a high-ranking prostitute's inheritance. But who were these women? For the most part, slaves or former slaves who had few other economic choices. The Roman system offered them no viable alternative. Once marked by infamy, the legal status that struck prostitutes, they could no longer marry a Roman citizen, testify before a tribunal, or recover any social respectability. Some, however, managed to turn this situation to their advantage. The story of Acca Laurentia, a prostitute who became a legendary benefactor of the Roman people, shows that social advancement wasn't impossible. But these exceptional successes shouldn't mask the brutal reality of most women's daily lives. The regulation of prostitution reveals the system's hypocrisy. Prostitutes had to register with the aediles, wear distinctive clothing, notably the masculine toga that marked their ambiguous status, and pay a special tax. This taxation, instituted under Caligula, was particularly cynical. The state profited from an activity it otherwise claimed to morally disapprove of. The supreme irony was that these fallen women sometimes exercised considerable influence. Volumnia Cythris, actress and courtesan, counted Mark Antony and Brutus among her lovers. Priscia influenced Pompey's political decisions. These women, officially rejected by society, gravitated at the heart of power. For Roman men, frequenting prostitutes was not only tolerated but quasi-obligatory. Cato, the elder himself, congratulated a young man he had seen leaving a brothel, considering it better that he satisfy his needs there rather than seduce another man's wife. This mentality considered prostitution a necessary safety valve for maintaining social order. The economic scale of this industry was staggering. In Pompeii alone, archaeologists have identified dozens of brothels, from luxury establishments to single-room operations above taverns. The city had a population of perhaps 15,000, suggesting that sex work was a major economic sector. The working conditions were brutal. Most prostitutes worked in tiny, windowless cells, barely large enough for a bed. These spaces, called cellae, were often located in the basements of buildings, literally underground. The women had no control over their clients, their schedules, or their earnings. They were essentially sexual slaves. Yet behind this facade of tolerance lay systematic violence. Prostitutes endured their clients' whims, their pimps' brutality, their owners' exploitation. Their life expectancy was dramatically reduced. Archaeological excavations at Ascalon revealed a mass grave of newborns in a brothel's sewers, chilling testimony to the fate reserved for children born from these commercial unions. The legal framework reinforced this exploitation. Prostitutes were classified as infames, infamous people, along with actors, gladiators, and executioners. This status meant they had no legal protection against violence or fraud. They couldn't make wills, inherit property, or testify in court except under torture. This double standard also applied to homosexual relationships. A Roman man could sleep with men without losing his respectability, provided he maintained his dominant role. Being penetrated was considered degrading, but penetrating a slave or man of inferior rank was normal. This logic of domination took precedence over sexual orientation per se. The categorization of sexual acts reveals this mentality clearly. Romans didn't think in terms of homosexual or heterosexual identity. What mattered was who was dominant and who was submissive. A man who took the passive role, regardless of his partner's gender, was considered effeminate and shameful. Male prostitutes existed, but operated in an even more precarious environment than their female counterparts. They served both male and female clients, though the evidence for the latter is scarce. These men, often very young, were completely outside social protection. Their fate was entirely at the mercy of their owners and clients. The bathhouses served as important venues for male prostitution. The complex social and sexual dynamics of these spaces made them perfect hunting grounds for both clients and sex workers. The mixture of nudity, relaxation, and social interaction created opportunities for commercial encounters. Gladiators occupied a particular position in this system. Officially infamous like prostitutes, they paradoxically exercised considerable erotic fascination. Their sweat was sold as an aphrodisiac, their favors sought by high society ladies. This contradiction reveals the complexity of desires in an officially repressive society. The gladiator cult among Roman women was extraordinary. These fighters, drawn from the dregs of society, slaves, criminals, prisoners of war, became unlikely sex symbols. Their muscular bodies, their courage in facing death, their exotic fighting styles captured female imaginations in ways that respectable citizens never could. Graffiti from Pompeii reveals the intensity of these feelings. Celadus, the Thracian girl's heartthrob, reads one inscription. Another declares a gladiator to be the glory of girls, the desire of women. These weren't just casual admirers. Some women risked their marriages and reputations for affairs with gladiators. The medical texts of the period describe gladiator sweat as a prized cosmetic ingredient. Women would pay premium prices for cloths soaked in their perspiration, believing it would enhance their own attractiveness and sexual appeal. This practice was so common that it became a recognized commercial trade. But this male sexual freedom had its reverse side, because while Roman men could satisfy their desires, they also lived in permanent terror of their wives' adultery. This obsessive fear would give birth to the most draconian laws in Roman history. The psychology behind this double standard reveals deep anxieties about masculinity and control. Roman men could dominate slaves and prostitutes, but they remained vulnerable to the one form of betrayal that could truly unman's them: their wives' infidelity. This vulnerability made them simultaneously libertine and paranoid, creating a toxic mixture of sexual license and violent jealousy. In the brutal world of ancient Rome, where death was entertainment and violence was art, an unlikely group of men emerged as the ultimate objects of desire: gladiators. These fighters, drawn from society's lowest ranks, became the fantasy figures of an empire. Their story reveals how danger, desperation, and raw physical power could transcend social boundaries in the most unexpected ways. To understand the gladiator phenomenon, we must first grasp just how far these men had fallen in society's estimation. They were infamous people ranked alongside prostitutes, actors, and executioners. They had no legal rights, no social standing, no hope of respectability. Yet, paradoxically, these same men drove Roman women wild with desire. The gladiator schools, called ludi, were essentially prisons where men were trained to die for public amusement. The largest of these, the Ludus Magnus, was connected directly to the Colosseum by an underground tunnel. Here, in cramped barracks that resembled military camps, hundreds of men prepared for what might be their final performance. The training was merciless. Dawn to dusk, these men practiced with wooden weapons under the watchful eyes of former gladiators called doctors. They learned not just to fight, but to die with style. The crowd wanted spectacle, drama, heroism in the face of certain death. A gladiator who died poorly could disgrace not just himself, but his entire school. Yet something extraordinary happened when these men stepped into the arena. The moment they walked through the gates, they transformed from society's refuse into something magnificent. Their muscled bodies gleamed with oil and sweat. Their exotic weapons and armor made them seem like gods of war. For those brief moments in the sand, they commanded the absolute attention of the most powerful people in the world. Roman women's fascination with gladiators was so intense, it became a cultural phenomenon. Graffiti from Pompeii tells the story. Celadus the Thracian makes the girls moan, reads one inscription. Another proclaims, Cresses, the net fighter, catches girls by night in his net. These weren't just casual admirers. These were women, so obsessed they carved their feelings into stone. The physical appeal was undeniable. These men were in peak physical condition, their bodies sculpted by constant training and combat. But it was more than just muscles that attracted Roman women. It was the aura of danger, the proximity to death, the raw masculine power that these fighters embodied. In a society where most men lived comfortable, civilized lives, gladiators represented something primal and exciting. Wealthy women would pay enormous sums just to spend time with gladiators. They would visit the training schools, ostensibly as patrons or spectators, but really to get close to their heroes. Some arranged private performances, hiring gladiators for intimate dinner parties, where the line between entertainment and seduction became dangerously blurred. The ultimate status symbol was gladiator sweat. Yes, you heard that correctly. Roman women believed that gladiator perspiration had aphrodisiac properties. They would pay merchants to collect sweat-soaked cloths from the training grounds, which they would then use as face creams and love potions. The more famous the gladiator, the higher the price his sweat would command. This trade was so lucrative that it became a recognized business. Vendors would station themselves outside gladiator schools with collection cloths, gathering the precious perspiration to sell to eager customers. The medical writer Pliny the Elder mentions this practice matters factly, as if trading in human sweat was the most natural thing in the world. But the gladiator obsession went far beyond mere physical attraction. These men represented everything that Roman society officially condemned but secretly craved. They were rebels who had nothing left to lose, warriors who faced death without flinching, outcasts who had achieved a kind of immortality through their courage. Some women took their obsession to dangerous extremes. Historical accounts tell of senators' wives who abandoned their families to run away with gladiators, throwing away wealth, status, and respectability for the chance to be with these dangerous men. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius's own daughter, Lucilla, was rumored to have had affairs with gladiators, though she was careful to keep such relationships secret. The homoerotic aspect of gladiator culture was equally significant, though more carefully hidden. In the all-male environment of the gladiator schools, intense relationships formed between fighters. These bonds went beyond mere friendship. They were partnerships forged in blood and desperation, where men depended on each other for survival. The famous story of Priscus and Verus illustrates this perfectly. These two gladiators, matched against each other in the arena, fought so brilliantly that Emperor Titus declared them both winners, granting them freedom. But legend says they had been lovers in the gladiator school, and their fight was as much an expression of their passionate relationship as it was a display of martial skill. Roman art and literature are full of homoerotic imagery, surrounding gladiators. Mosaics show fighters in poses that are clearly meant to be sexually suggestive. Poetry describes the beauty of young gladiators in language that goes far beyond mere aesthetic appreciation. This wasn't accidental. Roman audiences understood and appreciated these undertones. The gladiator schools themselves fostered these relationships. Men lived together in close quarters, shared the constant threat of death, and found comfort in each other's arms. For many, these relationships provided the only tenderness in lives otherwise marked by brutality and exploitation. Some gladiators were specifically trained to appeal to different sexual tastes. The retieri, who fought with nets and tridents, were often young and lightly armored, emphasizing speed and agility over brute strength. Their fighting style was considered more feminine, and they attracted admirers who preferred a more androgynous aesthetic. The Thracians, on the other hand, were heavily armed and armored, embodying a more traditional masculine ideal. Their exotic Eastern appearance and fierce fighting style made them particularly popular with women who fantasized about foreign lovers and dangerous adventures. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of gladiator sexuality was how it challenged Roman concepts of masculinity. These men were simultaneously the most and least masculine figures in Roman society. They embodied physical courage and martial prowess, the ultimate masculine virtues, yet they were also sexually available to anyone with enough money, male or female. This paradox created enormous tension in Roman society. How could men who represented the pinnacle of masculine achievement also be regarded as little better than prostitutes? The answer lay in Roman concepts of freedom and slavery. Gladiators, being slaves or condemned criminals, weren't really considered men in the full social sense. They were objects, extremely attractive and powerful objects, but objects nonetheless. The training itself often had homoerotic elements. Gladiators practiced in loincloths or naked, their bodies oiled and glistening. The doctors would position and reposition them, adjusting their stance and grip with hands-on instruction that was necessarily intimate. Massage and medical treatment for injuries provided further opportunities for physical contact. Evening entertainment in the gladiator schools often included sexual services for wealthy patrons. Both male and female clients would visit, and the gladiators were expected to perform sexually as well as martially. These encounters were carefully orchestrated by the Laniste gladiator owners, who saw them as additional sources of revenue. The psychological impact on the gladiators themselves was complex. Many embraced their sexual role as a form of power. The ability to drive the wives of senators wild with desire gave them a kind of revenge against the society that had condemned them. Others found genuine affection and even love in relationships formed under these extreme circumstances. Religious practices around gladiators also had sexual elements. Some cults worshipped gladiators as divine figures, believing that their blood had magical properties. Women would drink gladiator blood mixed with wine, believing it would grant them strength and fertility. These rituals often culminated in sexual encounters that were considered sacred rather than profane. The amphitheater itself became a space charged with sexual energy. The crowd's bloodlust and the gladiators' nearness to death created an atmosphere of intense excitement. Spectators didn't just watch the fights, they became emotionally and sexually invested in the warriors' fates. After particularly impressive performances, victorious gladiators would be showered with gifts from admiring spectators. Women would throw jewelry, scarves, and even personal items into the arena. These gifts were both tributes and invitations, signals of desire that the gladiators learned to read and respond to. But this sexual power came at a terrible price. The average gladiator's career lasted perhaps 5 years before death or retirement. Those who survived long enough to win their freedom often found that civilian life offered no place for their particular skills. They remained forever marked by their time in the arena, unable to fully integrate into respectable society. The gladiator phenomenon reveals something profound about human nature and sexual desire. In the most repressive and hierarchical society in history, physical courage and proximity to death could create a charisma that transcended all social boundaries. These men, who had lost everything society valued, became the very embodiment of what people secretly desired most. Roman law was renowned throughout the ancient world for its sophistication, its precision, its seemingly rational approach to human behavior. Yet, when it came to matters of love and sexuality, Roman legislation revealed a society struggling with its own contradictions, creating a legal framework that was simultaneously permissive and punitive, progressive and barbaric. The most famous and controversial of these laws was the Lex Aelia de Adulterius, enacted by Emperor Augustus in 18 BCE. This legislation didn't just regulate adultery, it transformed it from a private family matter into a state concern, with consequences that would reshape Roman society for centuries. Under the new law, adultery became a criminal offense, punishable by exile and confiscation of property. But the law's genius lay in its details, which revealed the deep gender inequalities at the heart of Roman society. A married woman who had an extramarital affair could be prosecuted and punished. Her lover faced similar penalties, but a married man who slept with unmarried women, slaves, or prostitutes faced no legal consequences whatsoever. This wasn't an oversight, it was the law's explicit intention. Roman legislators believed that adultery threatened the integrity of family bloodlines and property inheritance. A wife's infidelity could introduce illegitimate children into a family, corrupting the pure patrician bloodlines that formed the backbone of Roman society. A husband's affairs, by contrast, didn't threaten his legitimate family line. The enforcement mechanisms were even more revealing. If a father discovered his married daughter committing adultery in either his own house or his son-in-law's house, he was legally entitled to kill both his daughter and her lover on the spot. This wasn't just permitted. In some circumstances, it was expected. A father who failed to take decisive action could be accused of pimping his own daughter. But the law contained a crucial limitation that revealed its true priorities. The father had to kill both adulterers, or neither. If he killed only one, he could be charged with murder. This provision prevented fathers from accepting bribes to spare wealthy lovers while executing their daughters. Even in matters of honor killing, Roman law maintained its commercial sensibilities. Husbands had different but equally draconian rights. A husband who caught his wife's lover in the act could kill the man if he was of sufficiently low social status, a slave, freedman, actor, or gladiator. But if the lover was a respectable citizen, the husband was legally prohibited from killing him. Instead, he was required to divorce his wife immediately and bring formal charges. These distinctions weren't arbitrary. They reflected deep Roman anxieties about social hierarchy. Killing a fellow citizen was a serious matter that required legal process. but eliminating social inferiors who dared to defile a citizen's property could be done summarily. The law essentially granted husbands hunting licenses for lower-class men. The penalties for convicted adulterers were severe but precisely calibrated. Women lost half their dowry and 1/3 of their remaining property. They were also relegated to a tiny island, often Pandateria, where they lived in exile for the rest of their lives. Men forfeited half their property and were exiled to a different island, ensuring the lovers could never reunite. But perhaps most cruelly, convicted adulteresses were legally reclassified as prostitutes. They were forced to register with the aediles, wore the distinctive toga that marked sex workers, and could never again marry a Roman citizen. This legal transformation from respectable matron to infamous whore was considered a fate worse than death by many Roman women. The law's impact on Roman society was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, private bedrooms became matters of state interest. Neighbors were encouraged to spy on each other. Slaves were tortured to extract testimony about their master's sexual activities. And families were torn apart by accusations and counter-accusations. Emperor Augustus himself became the law's first high-profile enforcer when he was forced to prosecute his own daughter Julia for adultery. Julia, a witty and intelligent woman who had been married 3 times for political reasons, apparently conducted numerous affairs with prominent Roman men. When word of her activities reached Augustus, he had no choice but to apply his own law. Julia was exiled to the barren island of Pandateria, where she spent the last 14 years of her life in bitter isolation. Augustus refused all pleas for clemency, even from his wife Livia. "I would rather be Priam's daughter than Augustus's," Julia reportedly said, referring to the Trojan princess who died young but free rather than live long in captivity. The law's enforcement revealed its fundamental hypocrisy. While wives were monitored obsessively for signs of infidelity, husbands continued to frequent prostitutes, keep slave concubines, and engage in homosexual relationships without legal consequence. The law protected male property rights while giving men complete sexual freedom. But the most revolutionary aspect of Roman law wasn't its harshness. It was its approach to divorce. Rome was the first major civilization to allow relatively easy divorce for both men and women, though the process remained heavily skewed in favor of men. The traditional formula for divorce was brutally simple. The husband need only say, "Take your things and go," and the marriage was dissolved. No legal proceedings were required, no justification necessary. The wife had to leave immediately, taking only her personal belongings and whatever portion of her dowry could be recovered. But Roman law also recognized a form of divorce initiated by women, though the circumstances were strictly limited. A wife could dissolve her marriage if her husband was impotent, absent for extended periods on military campaign, or guilty of certain forms of extreme cruelty. However, she needed her father's permission and often faced social ostracism for exercising this right. The divorce process revealed Rome's practical attitude toward marriage. Since marriage was essentially a business contract between families, its dissolution should be handled like any other commercial dispute. Property had to be divided, children's custody determined, and financial obligations settled. Love, or its absence, was irrelevant to these proceedings. The speed with which Romans could divorce and remarry shocked other ancient civilizations. A Roman could be married in the morning, divorced by afternoon, and engaged to someone new by evening. This matrimonial carousel created complex webs of relationships that bound the Roman elite together in constantly shifting patterns of alliance and enmity. Children of divorced parents faced particular challenges. Roman law gave fathers absolute custody rights, meaning children typically remained with their father when parents separated. Mothers could be cut off from their children completely, never seeing them again after the divorce. This harsh reality kept many unhappy wives trapped in loveless marriages. The remarriage patterns of the Roman elite tell fascinating stories of political maneuvering disguised as romance. Women like Livia Drusilla married multiple times as their families sought to advance through strategic alliances. Men collected wives like political trading cards, each marriage serving specific dynastic or economic purposes. Some of the stranger Roman laws concerned the timing and circumstances of marriage. Certain months were considered unlucky for weddings, particularly May, which was associated with festivals honoring the dead. Couples who married during these periods were believed to be doomed to early death or childlessness. The law also regulated the elaborate ceremonies that surrounded Roman weddings. The bride's outfit, the sacrificial rituals, the procession to the groom's house. Every detail was prescribed by tradition and enforced by religious law. Deviation from these customs could invalidate the marriage or bring divine punishment. Roman inheritance law created additional complications for marriages and divorces. Sons inherited their father's property automatically, but daughters received only their dowries. This system encouraged families to produce male heirs while viewing daughters as financial burdens. The pressure to produce sons put enormous stress on marriages and led to the exposure or abandonment of unwanted girls. The legal status of concubines occupied a gray area in Roman law. These weren't legal wives, but they weren't mere slaves either. Concubinage was officially recognized as a legitimate relationship, especially for men who couldn't legally marry their preferred partners due to social differences. Children of these unions had limited inheritance rights, but weren't considered illegitimate. Some of Rome's most powerful women achieved their positions through concubinage rather than marriage. These relationships offered certain advantages. Concubines couldn't be easily divorced. They often maintained more independence than wives, and they could accumulate property in their own names. The evolution of Roman marriage law reflected broader changes in society. As the empire expanded and Roman citizenship was gradually extended to conquered peoples, the old restrictions on intermarriage began to break down. By the 3rd century CE, legal marriages between different social classes were becoming more common. But the law's most lasting innovation was its recognition of mutual consent as the foundation of marriage. Unlike many ancient societies where marriages were purely arrangements between fathers, Roman law required both bride and groom to express their willingness to wed. This principle would eventually influence Christian marriage doctrine and survives in modern wedding ceremonies. The legal framework surrounding Roman sexuality reveals a society struggling to balance individual desires with collective stability. The laws were simultaneously progressive and regressive, offering freedoms that were revolutionary for their time while maintaining inequalities that seem shocking today. Yet these contradictions were precisely what made Roman law so influential. By codifying both permissions and prohibitions, by creating detailed procedures for both marriage and divorce, Roman legislators created a legal template that would be copied throughout the Western world. The bizarre laws of love that governed Roman bedrooms would echo through European legal systems for 2 millennia. The legal treatment of rape reveals another disturbing aspect of Roman law. Rape of a free citizen was a serious crime, but the definition was narrowly focused on protecting male property rights rather than female bodily autonomy. A man who raped another man's wife or daughter was seen as violating the victim's male guardian, not the woman herself. Slaves, of course, could not legally be raped at all. Since they were property, any sexual act involving them was considered a property matter rather than a personal violation. This legal fiction allowed masters to sexually abuse their slaves with complete impunity, while maintaining the pretense of upholding moral standards. The age of consent laws were particularly revealing of Roman priorities. While 12 was the legal minimum age for girls to marry, there were no effective protections for younger children. Parents could betroth infants, and sexual contact with very young children was regulated more by social custom than legal prohibition. Roman law also struggled with questions of sexual consent within marriage. A husband's sexual rights over his wife were considered absolute, making marital rape not just legal but expected. Women who refused their husband's sexual demands could be divorced for failing in their wifely duties. The legal system's approach to homosexuality was complex and contradictory. Same-sex relationships weren't illegal per se, but they were regulated by strict rules about dominance and submission. A free Roman man could penetrate anyone of lower social status without legal consequences, but being penetrated himself was considered degrading and potentially criminal. These laws created a bizarre hierarchy where the same sexual act could be legal or illegal depending on who was doing what to whom. Social status, not sexual preference, determined legality. This system protected the sexual privileges of elite men while leaving everyone else vulnerable to exploitation. The enforcement of these sexual laws was often arbitrary and politically motivated. Accusations of adultery or sexual impropriety became weapons in political warfare, with enemies using sexual scandals to destroy their rivals' reputations and careers. But even the most comprehensive laws couldn't regulate the human heart or control the darker desires that flourished in Rome's shadows. For every public marriage ceremony conducted according to law, there were countless secret liaisons that defied all legal and social conventions. And in the deepest shadows of Roman society lay practices so transgressive that they were barely acknowledged, even in whispers. In the shadows of the great amphitheaters, beyond the marble columns of respectable society, ancient Rome harbored secrets so dark and disturbing that they were rarely spoken of, even in whispers. These were the hidden aspects of Roman sexuality that challenge our understanding of this supposedly civilized empire. Practices so transgressive they were erased from official histories, leaving only fragments of evidence for modern scholars to decipher. The most shocking of these hidden practices involved the bustareria, cemetery prostitutes who operated in the graveyards that surrounded Rome. These women, occupying the lowest rung of an already degraded profession, offered their services among the tombs and mausoleums where the city's dead lay at rest. The existence of cemetery prostitutes wasn't merely about economics, though poverty certainly drove some women to this desperate trade. There was something deeper at work, a connection between death and sexual desire that Romans found both terrifying and irresistible. The proximity to mortality, the transgression of sacred boundaries, the mingling of life's most intense pleasures with its ultimate mystery created an intoxicating cocktail that drew clients from across Roman society. These encounters took place in the dead of night, among monuments that housed the remains of Rome's greatest families. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. In daylight, these cemeteries were places of solemn remembrance, where families honored their ancestors with flowers and offerings. After dark, they became venues for the most degraded forms of human commerce. The bustuaria were often described as ghostly figures themselves, their pale skin made luminous by moonlight, their services paid for with coins placed over their eyes, like payments to Charon, the ferryman of the dead. Some clients claimed these women possessed supernatural powers, that coupling with them brought prophetic dreams or protection from death. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii and other Roman sites has revealed the extent of these practices. In the Porta Nocera cemetery, excavators found small chambers built into tomb complexes that could only have served as venues for sexual encounters. These spaces, hidden from casual view but accessible to those who knew where to look, provided privacy for the most forbidden liaisons. But cemetery prostitution was just one aspect of a broader Roman obsession with mixing the sacred and profane. Temple prostitution, though officially discouraged, flourished in connection with certain Eastern cults that had been imported into Rome. The goddess Isis, in particular, attracted followers who believed that sexual acts performed in her honor could grant divine favor. The cult of Magna Mater, the great mother goddess, included ritual castration performed by her priests called Galli. These men, having sacrificed their masculinity to the goddess, occupied a liminal space between male and female that made them objects of both reverence and sexual fascination. Some wealthy Romans sought them out for encounters that defied conventional categories of desire. The festival of Bonadea, the good goddess, was supposedly restricted to women only, with men forbidden from participating or even knowing what took place during the ceremonies. But whispered rumors spoke of wild sexual rituals, lesbian encounters, and the use of sacred objects in ways that would have scandalized respectable Roman society. The secrecy surrounding these female-only religious gatherings created space for expressions of sexuality that were otherwise impossible in Roman society. Women who spent their daily lives under strict male supervision could, for a few hours each year, explore desires and relationships that had no place in their normal existence. Some of the most disturbing evidence comes from magical papyri found in Egypt, which was part of the Roman Empire. These texts describe love spells and binding curses that reveal the desperate lengths to which Romans would go to control the objects of their desire. The spells often involved grave goods, sexual fluids, and ritual acts performed in cemeteries, showing clear connections between death, magic, and sexuality. One particularly chilling spell instructs the practitioner to obtain soil from a fresh grave, mix it with menstrual blood and semen, and bury the mixture under the threshold of the beloved's house while reciting incantations to the spirits of the dead. The belief was that this would bind the target's soul to the spellcaster, making them unable to resist sexual advances. The use of human remains in love magic was apparently common enough to require legal prohibition. Laws from the later empire specifically forbade the theft of bones and other body parts for magical purposes, suggesting that grave robbing for erotic sorcery was a serious problem. Roman medical texts reveal another hidden aspect of sexuality: the extent to which sexual practices were medicalized and regulated. Physicians prescribed specific sexual positions for different ailments, recommended particular partners for therapeutic purposes, and even performed surgical procedures to enhance sexual performance. The concept of sexual addiction was recognized and treated by Roman doctors, though their methods were often more harmful than helpful. Treatments ranged from dietary restrictions and cold baths to more extreme measures, like cauterization of the genitals or the administration of poisonous herbs that would reduce sexual desire by damaging the body's systems. Female sexuality was particularly pathologized. Women who showed excessive sexual interest were diagnosed with uterine fury and subjected to treatments that included forced exercise, restrictive diets, and in extreme cases, surgical removal of the clitoris. The medical texts reveal a deep fear of female sexual autonomy that went far beyond legal restrictions. The Romans also developed sophisticated techniques for birth control and abortion that have been largely forgotten by history. Silphium, a plant that grew wild in North Africa, was so prized for its contraceptive properties that it was harvested to extinction. Women would pay enormous sums for even small amounts of this herbal abortion. When silphium became unavailable, Roman women turned to increasingly dangerous alternatives. They would insert pessaries made from crocodile, dung, and honey, drink concoctions of lead and mercury, or undergo procedures that often resulted in death from infection or blood loss. The desperation that drove women to these extremes reveals the enormous pressure they faced to control their reproductive lives. The archaeological record from Pompeii has yielded disturbing evidence of infanticide and child abandonment. The bodies of newborns have been found in sewers, latrines, and garbage dumps throughout the city, suggesting that unwanted children were routinely disposed of like waste. This practice was legal under Roman law, which gave fathers absolute power of life and death over their offspring. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the practices surrounding child sexuality. Roman law set the age of consent at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. But evidence suggests that sexual exploitation of children began much earlier. Slave children had no protection whatsoever and could be used sexually from the moment their bodies were deemed capable of providing pleasure. The widespread availability of child slaves for sexual purposes created a market that extended throughout the Roman world. Children were bought and sold specifically for their sexual attractiveness, trained in techniques designed to please adult customers, and discarded when they grew too old to be desirable. This wasn't happening in the shadows. It was an open, legal trade that wealthy Romans participated in without shame. Educational texts from the period include detailed instructions on how to evaluate children for sexual purposes, how to train them in various acts, and how to maintain their health and attractiveness for as long as possible. These manuals were written by and for respectable Roman citizens who saw nothing wrong with treating children as sexual commodities. The religious practices surrounding child sexuality were equally disturbing. Some cults incorporated ritualized sexual abuse into their ceremonies, believing that the innocence and purity of children made their sexual energy particularly potent for magical purposes. These practices were often disguised as legitimate religious observances, making them difficult for authorities to prosecute even when they wanted to. The psychological impact of these practices on Roman society can only be imagined. Children who survived sexual exploitation often became perpetrators themselves, creating cycles of abuse that lasted for generations. The normalization of child sexual abuse may help explain some of the extraordinary violence and cruelty that characterized Roman society more broadly. Modern excavations continue to reveal new evidence of Rome's hidden sexual practices. Recent discoveries include purpose-built chambers for ritualized sexual encounters, artifacts clearly designed for extreme sexual practices, and artistic depictions of acts so transgressive they challenge our understanding of what was considered acceptable in Roman society. The frescoes found in Pompey's Villa of Mysteries have been reinterpreted by recent scholars as depicting not religious initiation ceremonies, as previously thought, but elaborate sexual rituals involving multiple participants, sacred objects used as sexual implements, and practices that blur the boundaries between spiritual ecstasy and physical pleasure. DNA analysis of human remains from Roman sites has revealed family structures that were far more complex than official records suggest. Children with multiple fathers, family trees that include incestuous relationships, and genetic evidence of systematic breeding programs all point to sexual practices that were kept hidden from official scrutiny. The Roman world's approach to sexuality was far more complex, darker, and more transgressive than the sanitized versions we learn about in school. Behind the facade of law and order lay a shadow empire where desire knew no boundaries, where the most basic human taboos were routinely violated, and where power and sexuality intertwined in ways that would be unthinkable in modern society. These hidden practices didn't disappear with the fall of Rome. They went underground, influencing medieval and modern attitudes toward sexuality in ways we're only beginning to understand. The secret history of Roman sexuality continues to shape our world in subtle but profound ways, reminding us that human desire remains one of the most powerful and dangerous forces in civilization. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of this hidden history is how completely it was erased from official memory. The Romans who practiced these things, who participated in this shadow economy of desire, were the same people who created laws, built monuments, and wrote the histories that defined their civilization for posterity. Their ability to compartmentalize, to live simultaneous lives of public virtue and private transgression, reveals something profound about human nature that we're still struggling to understand. The legacy of Roman sexuality isn't just historical curiosity. It's a mirror that reflects our own society's contradictions and hypocrisies. The same impulses that drove Romans to create elaborate justifications for their sexual practices continue to influence how we think about desire, power, and morality today. As we uncover more evidence of Rome's hidden sexual world, we're forced to confront uncomfortable truths about civilization itself. The line between progress and degeneracy, between sophistication and barbarism, between public virtue and private vice has always been thinner than we'd like to believe. Rome's secret history reminds us that the darkest human impulses don't disappear with education or civilization. They simply find new ways to express themselves. In the end, what Rome still hides from us isn't just information about ancient sexual practices. It's insight into the fundamental contradictions that exist at the heart of all human societies. The eternal tension between our public ideals and our private desires, between the civilization we claim to represent and the appetites we struggle to control. Understanding this hidden history doesn't excuse the Romans for their transgressions, but it does help us understand our own. For in their struggles with desire, power, and morality, we see reflections of struggles that continue to define human experience to millennia later. The questions they grappled with: how to balance individual freedom with social stability, how to regulate sexuality without destroying it, how to acknowledge human nature while aspiring to something higher, remain as relevant today as they were in the ancient world. Rome's hidden sexual history is ultimately a story about power, who has it, who wants it, and how it shapes the most intimate aspects of human experience. It's a reminder that sex has never been just about pleasure or reproduction, but about control, status, and the fundamental hierarchies that organize human societies. In revealing Rome's secrets, we discover not just what they did in their bedrooms, but who they really were as a civilization. And perhaps most importantly, we learn that the past is never really past, that the impulses and contradictions that defined Roman sexuality continue to influence our own relationships, laws, and social structures in ways we're only beginning to understand. The shadows of the Roman world still stretch across our modern landscape, reminding us that human nature remains both our greatest strength and our most dangerous weakness. As we reach the end of our journey through the hidden world of Roman sexuality, we're left with more questions than answers. How could a civilization that produced magnificent art, sophisticated law, and architectural marvels also harbor such dark impulses? How did they reconcile their public commitment to virtue with their private embrace of transgression? The answer lies in understanding that Rome was never the monolithic civilization we imagine from movies and textbooks. It was a complex, contradictory society where competing values, desires, and power structures created spaces for both greatness and depravity. The same legal system that protected property rights also enabled sexual exploitation. The same cultural sophistication that produced Virgil and Ovid also created markets for human misery. But perhaps that's the most important lesson we can learn from Rome's sexual history. Civilizations aren't defined by their highest aspirations alone, but by how they handle the eternal tension between ideals and reality, between what we claim to believe and what we actually do when no one is watching. Rome's legacy in matters of love and sexuality is complex and troubling, but it's also undeniably human. In their struggles with desire, jealousy, power, and morality, the Romans confronted the same fundamental challenges that face every human society. Their solutions were often brutal, sometimes innovative, occasionally inspiring, but always profoundly revealing of what it means to be human. As you navigate your own relationships in the modern world, remember that the questions that tormented Roman hearts still echo today. How do we balance personal desire with social responsibility? How do we protect the vulnerable while preserving freedom? How do we create laws and customs that acknowledge human nature without being destroyed by it? The Romans didn't solve these problems, and neither have we. But by understanding their successes and failures, their innovations and atrocities, we gain insight not just into the past, but into the eternal human condition that connects us across the millennia. The next time you swipe through a dating app or navigate a complicated relationship, remember that you're participating in struggles as old as civilization itself. The forms may change, but the fundamental questions remain the same. In that sense, we're all still living in Rome's shadow, still grappling with the same forces that shaped love and desire in the ancient world. And maybe that's exactly as it should be. For in understanding the past, we gain the wisdom to build a future that honors both our highest aspirations and our deepest humanity. The Romans may not have found all the answers, but they showed us which questions are worth asking. And sometimes that's the most valuable gift one civilization can leave to another.